So hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for stopping by. Great to see people already in the chat. Somebody noticed I had a typo in my title. Chris Ocon did. Thank you for that. I fixed it before we went live, so that was great to see. Thank you. Brianna is joining us tonight, but she's just going to be a couple minutes late. I don't know if you hear her over there. You can hear her spray can going. Yeah, that wasn't her spraying. That was her shushing. But she'll be here in just a few. Great to see people already having some discussions. As you know from the chat, well, we talk about everything here, but I want to talk a bit about Bernie and how I feel, at the very least, the case for him unendorsing Biden is growing, right? Like the case for him unendorsing Joe Biden is getting bigger and bigger. And how Elon Musk has always been bad. I know a lot of people, even maybe not like left people, like people who are clearly like on the left have always been skeptical, but a lot of fairly progressive people have sort of always liked Elon Musk because of his interest in green energy and space travel. But we'll talk about how he's sort of supporting the anti-lockdown protests and how he was wrong, but how that's actually Elon in character. That's who he's always been. We'll talk a bit about that. And of course, we can talk about Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro is, as usual, everyone who's a progressive knows he's awful. And he was awful again today when he basically implied that when it comes to the current health crisis, there are some people whose passing would be sadder than others. And he specifically referred to, people above 80, and he doesn't really care. Younger people he does, which is ironic because this was, of course, the guy who always warned about socialized medicine or a public option even, choosing who gets care and who doesn't, when he's seemingly implying that, if it was up to him to reduce sadness, he would make similar choices. So we'll talk a little bit about all of those things. We'll talk from the Canadian perspective. We'll talk, as David Dole has been doing, how for whatever reason, the Canadian people, largely because our broken media, we could talk about the Canadian media. David and I have done that before, but we could talk about how the broken Canadian media is in some ways worse than the American media and how it ignores the left. But we can also talk about all the things that Jagmeet Singh and the NDP are doing to improve the Canadian aid package, whether it was expanding it, helping to create specific help for students, ensuring that the wage subsidy, which the NDP improved, wouldn't go to companies that use and abuse tax havens. We can talk about all of those things and have some questions there. I mean, the main thing, I'm interested to see what people think, is like Bernie unendorsing. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. But I think it's important we have this discussion about, Bernie being a man of his word versus the context as it's developed. In another situation where Joe Biden didn't have a Tara Reade style story, I would say, as much as it pains me, Bernie was right to endorse Biden because Bernie's a man of his word, and you don't want the left to be seen as cynical. If somebody like Bernie runs and doesn't win, you want them to endorse if they've promised they would, because the next time a left-wing person runs, you don't want the argument to be, well, they're just running, and if they lose, they're going to take their ball home. And so, even though Biden's not a good candidate, and he doesn't believe in what we believe, Bernie made that promise. But I don't think Bernie and his movement, which sort of committed in broad terms to backing the nominee. I know not every individual person is committed to that, but the Bernie project was very clear. Like, we're trying to win, but we're going to endorse the winner if it's not us. I don't think that includes people like Joe Biden, given what we've learned increasingly about Tara Reade. I know this is not new. I know it's not new, and I know that people that have been following it very, very deeply have known about this for a long time. But for most people, it's really been in the last month or so that we've really got a sense for just how bad the Tara Reade story is, right?
I was not listening to you.
Babe.
I'm sorry. It's been 10 years. I tuned you out.
Babe.
I know. Sorry.
That's not nice.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so Brianna was not listening.
The...
Okay, record time, we're already demonetized. So we're just going to talk without me having to, I can say COVID and stuff. So yeah, Ben Shapiro thinks that it's sad when a young person gets coronavirus and dies, but not when an 81-year-old does. We could talk about how Ben's a monster like he has always been, except he's taken the mask off again.
I feel like my hair does not look good.
It's like that time, you guys remember when Ben Shapiro was like talking about how like some people have to like work 2-3 jobs to survive, and he's like, that's a you problem. And I'm like, you fucking grifter. Like, he just gets all of his money from dark right-wing, money, Koch brothers and things like that. Like, if you guys can get George Soros to sponsor, to give me Patreon money, that would be great. So I could compete with Ben. But like with Bernie, like I feel like that wasn't part of the deal, was endorsing somebody that did something awful to Tara Reade and other women as well. And that's beyond the fact that, like, we see how Joe acts in public. We've seen it. Like, whether or not you think that's automatically disqualifying, it's like when you combine that with the stories, it's much more believable. Like, believe all women, yes, or believe most every woman, maybe not every single last woman, but believe women. But, like, if somebody had those accusations about Barack Obama, who, like, whatever you think of him, and I don't think very highly of him, has never had that sort of scandal. Never. Like, Obama's never done something like that. Mm-hmm. So you'd be like, okay, this is kind of coming out of nowhere. But Biden, there's like 8 other women, and then there was he always touches young girls, and it's just so creepy, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I think that there's a credible argument for Bernie Sanders to unendorse Joe Biden and to re-enter the campaign. And I know it's not Biden's fault. It actually isn't Biden's fault, but the decision by the New York Democratic Party to basically take Bernie and Yang and people off the ballot, even though they wanted to remain on the ballot and had qualified, they had done enough in terms of signatures and whatnot to be on the ballot. I think that's a travesty, and I almost feel like, I know it's not about Biden, but it's about like the principle that Bernie is like, if you're going to try to take me off the ballot, I'm going to run on every primary. I feel like Bernie, if anything, and most of you will agree, a lot of my channel think that he bent over too fast for Biden, and without enough concessions. Mm-hmm. And yet they're still like trying to like stomp him down whenever they can, right? Like don't come at me with like Bernie hurt Hillary. Bernie did so much for Hillary, but he ran till like May, June against Hillary. This time he dropped out in basically in April. Yep. Right? Like, he did everything they wanted in the way they wanted it, did fundraising emails for them, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's still what more do they want? So
I think we have a super chat. Oh yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Samantha Sider, believe Tara, #dropout Joe.
Yeah. Samantha, thank you so much for the super chat. Great hashtags. I've been using them in some of my videos. And yeah, I believe Tara. I think that, again, her story is eminently credible. From the time I heard that Katie Halper interview, right, which is when I made my first video on this story after watching that interview. I was like, I have to say something about this story. Mm-hmm. And then all of the stuff since. She mentioning that her mother called Larry King and talked about it in veiled terms. And then we find the Larry King transcript and then the video. Mm-hmm. And then her former neighbor, who's a Biden supporter, like a hardcore Biden supporter, was like, yeah, she told me about this in 1995, 96, when we were neighbors after she left Washington, after she left Biden's office. And then somebody else she worked with in the California State Senate office of one of, California State Senator, after she worked for Biden, Tara basically said, well, at my previous job, it wasn't a very safe place to work. And they talked about that. And that was confirmed as well. Like, she is telling the truth. I think she's an extremely credible witness. And I believed her as well, Christine Ford, vis-a-vis Brett Kavanaugh. But I feel there's more evidence here. Mm-hmm. Like, all of it's circumstantial. In a court of law, none of this would be enough, right? We can like it or not, but Joe Biden, there was no way you'd get a guilty conviction based off that. But in the court of public opinion, preponderance of evidence matters, right? And I feel she's got a stronger case than Christine Ford did, and I believed her too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, you ready for some questions?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Dan Cordobin, he says, will there be blowback on the Liberals as SNC-Lavalin gives out huge bonuses to CEOs, all while cutting jobs?
I mean, you'd hope, but right now it's tricky. Like, SNC-Lavalin was the reason probably why the Liberals started to slip last time. If you remember, going into 2019, going into the year, the Liberals were in the high 30s. They were kind of cruising either to a majority or right on the cusp. And then the SNC-Lavalin story happened, and they never quite recovered. Now, they were lucky that because of the broken first-past-the-post system, they were able to win a strong minority government. But, the Conservatives beat them in vote total. Like, Andrew Scheer got more votes than Justin Trudeau. And that was the worst election result for a winning party in Confederation since 1867. Technically, in 1867, Sir John A. Macdonald's Conservatives got less votes, but it was a weird system where people ran under various parties but were sort of umbrellaed with either the Liberals or Conservatives. It was very weird in 1867. Like,
Canada was weird in
Yeah,
1867.
and so basically, it was the weakest mandate in Canadian history, and probably what kicks it all off is SNC, because if SNC doesn't happen, then the fight with Jane Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould doesn't happen, and then that all comes out, and so you would think it would have an effect, but everyone is so preoccupied right now, at least, with COVID, with the medical side of it, the public safety side of it, the global stories around Trump and China, and then you throw in, debates about aid packages, the CERB, the student benefits. It's just, I'm watching the news, I'm watching the nightly news more than I have in years, since we've cut cable, basically. Mm-hmm. Watch it every morning on YouTube, from the previous night, and it's they spend there so much coverage is on the day-to-day COVID stuff that I haven't heard anything about SNC on the news, which is compared to this time last year when SNC was the story. I just don't see it cutting through now. Now, after this starts to slow down and the dust settles, maybe some of these things start to come to the forefront, and maybe then they have an effect. But right now, it's I'm not hearing any of that.
No.
Apparently,
Aaron C. is watching tonight from New Zealand.
Fantastic. So that's great.
Cool.
That's great. What time is it in New Zealand? It's gotta be
tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's gotta be different. It's gotta be I can't even quantify, because it's like Europe. I know it's England's 5 hours ahead. So Central Europe is 6, Greece is 7. I know that. So it's but once I get that far away, I can't even quantify.
It's just tomorrow.
Is it 16 hours? I don't know, right?
Justin Pangano said I was late because I was playing Christo ball.
Oh.
I was not. I was trying to fix my hair, which did not work, and it's out of control. So.
I'm also inventing new games for the side yard to play with my son. He's starting to get to the age now where he can throw balls and catch balls. So Brianna's excited for all these new games.
Yes, I had to stop a game today that was hit a ball off the second-story window.
Yeah, it's a soft ball, not a softball, but a soft bouncy ball.
Okay, so a left state of mind is trying to say something about Don Davies.
Okay.
But I'm not sure. What did Don Davies do this week? Proposed something cool? Don Davies?
Yeah, Don Davies has been. Are you talking about pharmacare? I know Don's been talking about pharmacare before COVID and then during it. And I know Singh today actually put a motion forward to make the CERB universal. Not that every person would have a check sent to them, but that anyone who just needed help right now could apply, get the $2,000, and then if they actually didn't need it, it would be rectified on next year's taxes. That was not approved. I didn't see who rejected it. A motion like that requires unanimity, to just have it happen. So it could have been one MP, or it could have been all of the Liberals and all the Conservatives. That wouldn't surprise me, because the Liberals and Conservatives don't support that universality. But I know Don is, as the health critic, is spearheading the fight for pharmacare. And I think that much like how a lot of Americans who are maybe watching, you guys are, most of my viewers have been supporters of Medicare for All, but in the context of millions, dozens of millions of people losing their health care because they're losing their job or because their spouse or parents lost their job, like we're in a situation where Medicare for All is rising in popularity. And here in Canada, we have universal health care, but it doesn't include, for most people in most provinces, your teeth or your medicine. Yeah. And so if you lose your job, you could still go to the doctor. If you need a procedure, you need a surgery, you can still get it. But when it comes to getting a prescription, if you don't have workplace coverage, you have to pay for that out of pocket. Or if you need dental work, you have to pay for that out of pocket. And so people losing their jobs are now losing their medical and dental coverage. Mm-hmm. And I think that will increase calls for Medicare, for pharmacare and dental care.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Just going back to a question that a comment that you heard before. You said before. So Imadal says, in the 1860s, the Liberals and Conservatives didn't really exist. It's laughable that you even brought up the terms while talking about the 1860s.
Well, I mean, okay. I'm going to go to Wikipedia.
You have a PhD in Canadian history.
Yes. I'm going to bring up the 1867 election in Canada. This was the first election Canada had. This was the first election Canada had since when all four of the original provinces united. There were three parties. The Conservative Party was led by Sir John A. Macdonald. The name is Conservative. The Liberal Party didn't technically have a leader, but George Brown, who was the head of the Globe and Mail, also viciously anti-union, was the unofficial Liberal leader. He lost his seat, but the Liberals got 22% of the vote. And in Nova Scotia, at least, there was a strong contingent of anti-Confederates. These were people that didn't want to actually be part of Confederation, and they voted for the anti-Confederate party. Some of them wanted to just be an independent colony more strongly linked to Britain. Some of them were actually pro-American annexationists. That party would largely disappear by the 1872 election. But to be very clear, there was a Liberal Party and a Conservative Party from the very beginning of Canadian history. It's as simple as that. Now, whether the ideologies were similar is very different, but that's what the parties were called. Capital C Conservatives and capital L Liberals. And those are two parties that continue to exist, at least in some form, to this day.
Okay, ready for another question?
Yes.
Oh, we have a super chat.
Sorry, John.
John Barlich. So John says, hey, why aren't more progressive members in Congress fighting for workers' rights during this pandemic and applying pressure?
I mean, John, it's a great question. Right now, workers' rights are crucial. They're always important. I don't know if anybody saw, but on social media, I posted it, that from about 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. today, I was doing radio on the CBC, which is sort of like our NPR, as an analog, and talking about workers' rights during the COVID-19 crisis. And I think it's teaching us that, like, the workers that have always been essential, more and more people are starting to realize that. Mm-hmm. And whether or not that's actually going to lead to economic benefits that these workers need is another question. But it's the debate is there. We do need to see more of that. I think one of the barriers, at least, is I believe Nancy Pelosi isn't recalling the House, which means that even if they wanted to, it's very difficult. So a lot of them have been reduced to doing it on social media. I know AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib have in various ways talked about this, and it's been great to see. Another challenge is that when you're trying to move legislation quickly, you have to balance what you want versus what is available, because often unanimity matters. So the NDP here in Canada, when we wanted to improve the CERB, we had a choice to make where it was like, if we oppose the legislation, then no one gets any help, maybe for weeks. Or we say, we disagree with this as written, but in the interests of ensuring aid gets delivered, we will grant unanimity to this. Because if you don't have unanimity, you have to go through committee. It needs to go through like 3 votes. It could take weeks. People don't have weeks, right? And so what you do is then you campaign for it outside of the legislature, outside of the House. Whether or not that's the best strategy, it was sort of what they were trying to do. And I think, at least indirectly, you saw Jagmeet Singh, the NDP, and progressives and student groups on social media and traditional media keep hammering home the point. The aid packages aren't helping the Canadians that need the most help. And then, not enough, but there hasn't been enough improvement, but there's been sufficient improvement in the right direction that more and more people are getting help. And that's because of that pressure. And so in a traditional legislative context, you would provide amendments. You maybe vote against the legislation to try to get better legislation. In this case, it's very tricky to do.
Okay, we have another super chat. Chase Lucas, and they say, what can the NDP do, if anything, to better capitalize on the positive influences they've had over the federal COVID response? Oh, that's a good question.
I mean, that's a great question. And this is like, we get to the point of like, clearly there's media bias against the NDP. It's undeniable. The NDP has, I would say, a bigger uphill battle with the media than even Bernie did, because the U.S. has a more robust alternative media landscape. There's the Young Turks, there's Crystal Ball. These people get millions of views, hundreds of millions of views a month sometimes. Maybe, I don't know that much, but they get a lot of views, right? You could see it. They get a ton of views. There's not really the same thing in Canada. The volume isn't there. We have Passage now, which is new, but they have Jacobin, which is massive, that you can have these sources. But, the NDP does need to be pushing these things more. I think Singh doing more live streams and finding a way to get those live streams some bigger numbers is helpful. Matthew Green, for instance, has basically been doing daily live streams on various platforms, talking about his plan, what he's been doing, what's happening in Ottawa, what the NDP is doing, what the NDP would do if we were in government, how we disagree or agree with certain approaches we're seeing. And he's been doing that, again, almost every day, and he calls it bringing Parliament to the people. And I'm actually scheduled to be with him on his live stream on Friday, at least tentatively as of now, probably sometime around 3 p.m. or so, Friday afternoon. So that's something that we need to see more of. Is Jagmeet's he's a charismatic guy, he's a fun guy. Young people like Jagmeet a lot. He needs to tap into sort of what AOC and Bernie have done, which is really like mobilizing live streaming. I think that's a great way of doing it. Maybe more frequent press conferences, maybe trying to, like Trudeau goes live at 11. Maybe Singh should say, like, I'm going to go live at 1 or 2 or whatever every day to respond to the Prime Minister. I don't know if the media would even cover it. The media just often ignores the NDP, but maybe I'm being too cynical there. I think there's more the NDP can do, but certainly the media in this country is playing an awful role. There was a great example that one of my fellow NDPer from Ontario, Ian Borsuk, found, which is that a journalist wrote a piece about the tax haven issue. Yeah. And it painted it as the Liberals were rejecting the calls to not help tax dodging companies. Mm-hmm. And it was all like, this was the Bloc's idea. And the Bloc was part of this. But the NDP was also a part of it. And like Nikki Ashton and Scott Duvall wrote letters to the Prime Minister, to the Liberal government, bringing up the tax evasion concern. And it was brought up by the NDP during question period. And this journalist actually retweeted one of those NDP questions from question period. And then when it came time to write the piece, there was no mention of the NDP whatsoever. I don't know if the Toronto Star made him edit out any mentions of the NDP. I'm not sure. But that was a case of a journalist knowingly excluding, or a source knowingly excluding, news about one particular political party to push a narrative that the NDP is not there. And so it's a vicious cycle, right? Because you'll say like, oh, the NDP is irrelevant. The NDP is invisible. Well, it's because the media doesn't cover them, and so people don't pay attention to it. One thing I will say, and this is something we can all do, is share NDP stuff, guys. Share it to Reddit. If you go to On Guard for Thee now, one of the big Canadian subreddits, sort of like the alternative to the increasingly alt-right R Canada, I have a screenshot of one of Jagmeet's tweets that's blown up. It's got like over 5,000 upvotes. Hundreds of thousands of people will see that potentially. And so, share NDP stuff around. We can all do a little bit in that regard.
Okay, should we take another Canadian question, or should we
just keep firing?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Craig Adolphi says, have you seen Jag's Instagram live sessions lately? He's talking to people about COVID-19, CERB, etc., and he gets various people to join his stream and share a talent like music. Dangerously charming. He is dangerously charming.
Jagmeet's very charming. So I think he's doing good stuff. I want him to get the volume, and I wonder if one thing the party could do, and actually after this stream, I'll send an email to the people I know inside the structures and say, like, maybe you should send out an advance link to your entire NDP mailing list to say, everyone tune into Jagmeet. Maybe getting everybody on board will drive the numbers. And of course, as you know, whenever you're talking about social media, whether it's YouTube or anything else, if a ton of people are watching something, a social media outlet will be like, okay, lots of people are watching. I want more people to watch this, right? So like, it's like a snowball rolling down a hill. So I think more coordination within the activist structures to say, hey, Jagmeet goes live, everybody tune in. And I think like that, maybe that's something that the party should do. Or if they have been, I've been missing it. I don't know.
Okay, Manny J says, the Democrats have played this election all wrong. Progressive wing is the future with or without the party. By picking Joe, they sealed their fate. They could have worked with Bernie.
I mean, look, I agree. Well, here's the thing with Joe. He could still win. Like, he could still win. The polls are showing that he's still winning. So I don't want to make any definitive statement. What I've said on this channel is Joe is an unnecessary risk, but the man can still win. Like, nothing's guaranteed. Like, Hillary Clinton lost, and we know why she lost, and a lot of us, like, were not surprised when she lost. Mm-hmm. But she could have won that election. And if you run that election 100 times, she wins like 95 of those times. Right? So, like, we have to be real here. There's a perfectly reasonable chance Biden can win. But it's like they're not even doing the things they need to do for Biden to win or to just guarantee victory. Look, as much as we disagree, like, the Tara Reade story matters, but if Biden came out, and a lot of hardcore Bernie supporters would not believe him, but the vast majority of people in politics are not as engaged or as strident as we are. And if Joe Biden came out tomorrow with Bernie and said, I have been converted to Medicare for all. I was wrong. This is not a flip-flop. This is me seeing the realities of what happens when you have a pandemic and that millions of people lose their health care overnight or over a couple weeks. I have learned my lesson. Bernie has spoken with me about this, and I now support Medicare for all. And I'm making a commitment to work with Senator Bernie Sanders to implement Medicare for all. Guys, I don't care if we think Tara Reade deserves justice. I don't care if the hardcore Bernie supporters on YouTube and Twitter don't believe him. Joe Biden wins a mega majority if that happens. It's game over. He wins an Obama 2008 style victory. It's done. Doesn't deserve it, but that's what will happen. And he's not even doing it. Medicare, David Dole had a video out like a couple days ago. 69% support for Medicare for all. Strong numbers among independents. People are going to start saying nice in the chat soon about this. Watch, because
what are you talking
whenever
about?
You say 69 on the internet, people say nice. No, of course, Femi, but Biden is never going to say that. But that's what's frustrating about Biden, because he could just win this election, but he would rather lose than give every American health care. Like, you know what I mean? He would rather lose than say, hey, everybody gets health care. That's why it's frustrating. The man can win. He could still win with all of this going on. Trump is that awful a president. But my goodness, are the Democrats trying to lose? It seems like. That's what it seems like. They're trying to lose. It's almost like they're like, okay, we want to win, but we don't want to win too hard. So let's like mess this up 5 or 6 times a week and keep this competitive.
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Okay. We have another super chat from John Bartledge.
Nice.
You and the internet are really weird.
Yeah.
Okay. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Okay, so they say, this is an old one, but a good one. Not the less how do you get money? Nonetheless, how do you get money out of politics in America?
Well, I mean,
Sorry, I stumbled on that one there.
It's a tricky one, right? I mean, I think the big push has to be repealing Citizens United. Like, that's got to be the big one. Because in Canada, one of our differences is that we have PACs. Like, so in Canada, there's a max donation limit. It's lower than the American one, but it's there. But you know, unions and corporations can't donate directly to political parties, and there are PACs, but they're strictly limited in how they can operate. With regard to third-party advertising, if we recall.
Are you talking about the unions?
Yeah, unions. Well, in Canada, like third-party advertising and stuff during the election, there was very strict guidelines about how you could do it. And so I think putting control over non-direct campaign contributions as much as is possible is the biggest single thing you can do. There's a lot of other things. Like, I still think, even in Canada, the maximum you can give, what is it? What's the maximum donation? It's like $1,300?
$1,350?
Yeah. And then in some jurisdictions, you can give another $1,300 during the writ, like during the actual election period. But that's still too high. I would almost say the best way to do it is publicly fund elections. Give a max donation of, like, say, $100 with a generous tax credit so that it's effectively almost free for everyone to give their $100 to a political party. It means that poor people can support a party without actually having to lose the few little money they have. And rich people can support a party but can't use their money to have outweighed influence. Mm-hmm. So that would be my approach. We used to have in Canada a per vote subsidy. For every vote you got a couple of bucks to your party, but that was gotten rid of by the Conservatives and not re-implemented by the Liberals, which has made it difficult for the NDP as a party that represents, in general, lower income people. So that's what you do. Citizens United is the biggest thing that has to be gotten rid of, 100%. 100%.
Okay. So we have another super chat from Burger Man. Thank you so much for your support. They say, didn't Bernie unendorse Sank for much less? He could do it, but mainstream media would eat him alive again. Maybe when there's more pressure.
Burgerman, thanks for the question and comment and support. To my knowledge, technically at least, Cenk did not get unendorsed by Bernie. Cenk released all of his endorsements from those outside his jurisdiction. That is my understanding. Now, would Bernie have unendorsed him if Cenk didn't do that? Maybe. But yes, you're right. Whether or not you feel that it was worthy of unendorsing Cenk, or some people didn't agree with the Cenk endorsement, some people did, it was about far less than what Joe Biden. Cenk said awful things about women. He said misogynistic things, very ugly things, but he said things in an abstract sense. He was not accused of anything as bad as Joe Biden did, right? And so, yes, even if whether he did it or Cenk withdrew the endorsement or what have you, it was not nearly as bad as what Joe Biden is being accused of doing. No, not anywhere close. Not anywhere close.
Okay, so we have another super chat from Jeannie McGraw, and they say, "What's your opinion of the Bloc Québécois Party? What are their goals, and what is the U.S. equivalent if there is one? I'm an American, and I'm curious."
Yeah,
that's a nice American. Like American asking a Canadian content question.
Yeah, for sure. And this is something that we could talk about more. Again, like I keep bringing it up, but I am working on a podcast that's more Canadian focused, so it'll be in a podcast format, and I would encourage Canadians and Americans who want to learn more about Canada to listen to that when that's out of development. But in general, the Bloc is something that doesn't really exist in the United States. In the Bloc Québécois is a unique party in that it only runs for seats federally, so it's not a provincial party, it's not a statewide party. It runs at the national level, but it only runs for seats within the province of Quebec. So it can never really form government. I mean, hypothetically, if there was 7 or 8 parties, it could win all the seats in Quebec, finish first. But it's there to represent the interests of Quebec. The party at times is more definitively separatist, aka the explicit goal of the party is for Quebec to leave Canada, to sever Quebec from Canada, whereas some other times, as of right now, the party is more autonomist. The goal of the party is to ensure that Quebec's rights and distinct culture and society are protected, but they're not necessarily sharing the immediate goal of separation. In terms of, it would be equivalent of, let's say there was one province or one state, a big state, let's say Texas, was majority Hispanic, and they had a province and Texas was a state where the first language was not English but French. Spanish, but not English but Spanish. And this state elected, Texas Bloc, members. And they were there to represent the Spanish language, historically the Catholic religion, and then the rights of the ethnic Spanish Americans or ethnic Mexican Americans in the United States. That would be the goal of the party. Some of them would be separatists. Some of them would merely be, there to protect the autonomy of their culture. In terms of ideology, it is on economic matters somewhat left-leaning, but not explicit, not terribly. And on cultural matters, it really depends. They are definitively a pro-choice feminist party, but my God, do they hate when Muslim women get to wear what they want to wear, or when Sikh men get to wear what they want to wear. And so the party is frankly a rather xenophobic party. And people in Quebec might classify it as protecting, French-Canadian culture, but I don't buy that. It's a xenophobic party that has used and weaponized Muslim women, Sikh men, as vote getters to say that these people are coming and destroying Canadian culture, destroying Quebec culture. So at times they're one of the more progressive parties, second only to the NDP on some economic and social issues. But then at other times they're more restrictive on Muslim rights than even the conservatives, even Andrew Scheer's conservatives. So they're a very interesting party. There's nothing like them in the United States. There's nothing like them at all.
Okay, so we have a couple more super chats. So, Joseph Mangano, what do you think about the news? Jeff Weaver is behind a super PAC to push Biden left and boost his appeal with Biden's problem constituencies.
Yeah. So Joseph, thanks for the super chat and for your support. Joseph's also a channel member. The stories have been really interesting. I haven't made a video about it because with my son home, it's like I have to find videos for the perfect timing of the day. But I've been following.
Maybe you should get up earlier.
I was up at 5:45 this morning. So in any case, it was there's a lot of debates happening right now within the Bernie camp. You have people like Brianna Joy Gray who are very clearly not jumping on the Biden bandwagon. They are not, right? And then you have people like Jeff Weaver, who's a Bernie alumni all the way back to 2016. He's been a longtime Bernie guy. They're both from Vermont, who is basically set up a super PAC, which Bernie does not agree with, which is there to support Biden. And you're getting a lot of debate within all the former Bernie staffers about what the right strategy is. And one thing you're also hearing is real tea. You're getting a lot of the tea spilt right now. So I forget his name, but one of Bernie Sanders' staffers said that Jeff Weaver resisted a lot of the progressive moves within the inner circle. Specifically also, Jeff Weaver made it difficult to implement more African-American outreach. That's what we've been hearing. Now, this is all speculation and rumors. I don't know, but there's been a lot of discussion about that. And so, in general, I don't like the idea of setting up super PACs. That's in opposition to the Bernie message. And look, telling people to vote for Biden, I don't agree necessarily, but I'm not going to be mad at people that, again, I've noted it on the channel. I'm not mad at vote blue no matter who people. They have a reason to do that, but neither am I mad at people that want to vote for the Green Party. I'm not mad at either of those people. They have their reasons to do it. And, I'm just here trying to bring democratic socialist ideas to YouTube. But I disagree with this approach. And if what we're hearing is true, it does seem like Jeff Weaver was a barrier to some of the young, more strident, more progressive staffers within the Bernie camp. And I wonder if we'll hear more, especially maybe after the election in November.
Sorry,
what?
I'm reading something. It's fine.
Yeah, and people are also noting Chuck Rocha, who is actually he did a great job. And Chuck, to his credit, we can be mad at him now, but Chuck was a major part of Bernie's success with Latino Americans. But he's gone on to create I think he's separate from Weaver, but he's also gone on to create a group to help win Bernie people over to Biden.
Dan Cordovan is saying, you got up at 5:45 this morning. Do you CBC? What time do you normally get up? I was just joking.
Yeah.
He gets up early, just fine.
We get up. We're usually up between about 6:50 and 7:30. It depends when our son gets up.
Yeah.
He is the master of that regard. Yeah.
Okay, we have some more super chats. So Ben Riley says Bernie seems like he adheres to Kantian ethics, so it's against his categorical imperative to be aggressive or go for that, even if game theory says that's good for strategy in a zero-sum game.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a philosophy expert, so I don't I'm not an expert on Kantian ethics, but I do think in general, Ben, you make a great point where Bernie is almost too nice for where he was. I mean, Bernie's what made Bernie able to get to where he was is who Bernie is. But in that crucial moment where Bernie needed to be a bit more aggressive, frankly, to go for the jugular, he didn't do it. And who knows if it would have made the difference? Maybe it doesn't make a difference. Maybe Bernie still loses. But the thing is, Bernie needed to realize that him going at Biden hard wouldn't have burned any bridges. Do you see how Elizabeth Warren talked about Michael Bloomberg? And yet, when all was said and done, they endorsed the same guy, right? Did you see how, Cory Booker was calling Joe Biden's dementia and cognitive decline out before most of us were? Mm-hmm. He was the one last, October, basically being like, this guy can't get the football over the line. I don't even know if he can hold the football. Basically saying, you're a senile old man, Joe, step aside. And he endorsed him. So, Bernie should have gone right at him. And then, look, he could have still endorsed him. I don't know. I think Bernie should have been more aggressive. There was a lesson that we learned, and we sort of all forgot it because, the month between Iowa and Super Tuesday was simultaneously the longest and shortest month I can remember, right? Mm-hmm. It was just before COVID, so we didn't know, before it came to North America. So we didn't really know much about that yet. Bernie won Iowa. Screw Buttigieg, he didn't win. Bernie won Iowa. Bernie won New Hampshire. Demolished Nevada. But if we recall what happened, a week or two before Iowa, Bernie went hard at Biden on Social Security. Do you remember this? You guys remember this, right? Bernie went hard at Biden, not disrespectful. Bernie wasn't calling him names. Bernie wasn't lying. He wasn't mudslinging. He was simply saying, here's what Joe Biden has said recently and in the 1990s about Social Security. I do not think this is the way forward for our movement or for the country, and I think this is a liability. Bernie was still Bernie. He was still Bernie, like very respectful, very measured, but spoke the truth about Joe Biden. And what happened with Joe Biden? Man started to tank. And he finished like fourth or fifth in Iowa, fifth in New Hampshire, like second in Nevada, but like a distant second to Bernie. And Bernie should have kept on hammering Biden at that moment. He should have kept on doing it. And he failed to do that. And again, I don't know if that makes a difference, but it's something he stopped doing. We saw the effects. Bernie went hard at Biden, and it worked. It worked.
Okay, someone was asking whether or not Ben was referring to Keynesian economics, but I think he's actually referring to Kant, the philosopher.
Yeah, Immanuel Kant. Yeah.
Okay, so Ben O'Reilly, again with a super chat, says, Humanist Report is going to be on the drunken peasants.
Oh, that's exciting. That's a great source. For those who don't know, Humanist Report, Mike Figueredo's a very nice supporter of this channel. He's got a massive YouTube channel, and he's been, kind of kind to me, even when my channel was much smaller. And, for a lot of people who know, I filled in for him, around just after Super Tuesday, which of course didn't go our way. But he's always been very kind to highlight my work. So I'm always excited to see him make connections too. And I think these connections are great. I think that, we build more ties within left-wing spaces on podcasts and YouTube channels. It's a great way of growing the concentric circles of the audiences. Yeah.
And guys, if you can remember to hit that like button, that would really help us out between reading
super chats. Apparently, when you leave chats and you leave comments, it helps helps YouTube promote it to more people.
Yeah. And thank you everyone in the comments who are constantly advocating for us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. It really helps.
Okay. We have another super chat from Arlene Chambers. And they say, what are your thoughts about Jesse Ventura? Who is Jesse Ventura?
So Jesse Ventura was a former WWF wrestler.
I knew I recognized that name.
But when it was still called the WWF. And was a governor. Was it governor of Minnesota, guys? I'm not sure.
So he was probably friends with the governor of California.
Yeah, he might. I don't know if he knew Schwarzenegger. And he was like a political outsider, right? Let me just double check. I'm gonna look. Jesse Ventura. Jesse Ventura was governor of Minnesota. Yes, so he's governor of Minnesota about 20 years ago. But he was also a mayor and was sort of an independent guy. So he was sort of a political wild card. My view of him is that in some ways I have a lot to like, but then the guy has also taken fairly conservative stance. Sometimes he's been like an anti-tax crusader. And so for me, I see him as a fundamentally decent person, but he is far too ideologically unstable for me to get behind him, right? That's my view. I would need to see a much stronger commitment to democratic socialism before I would support someone like Ventura. Now, is he better than Biden and Trump? In many ways, probably, but he's not somebody I would necessarily pick if I was going to pick a candidate. I want somebody much more consistently democratic socialist. And he seems to be more I think both parties are bad, not from like our perspective, which is like both parties are bad because they're both too far right. Whereas Ventura, I think sometimes is like almost in an Andrew Yang type way, is like we have to rise above the left-right dichotomy. And I don't like that. Like I hate that debate. Like the left-right dichotomy is bad. No, it's not. The left is correct. The right is wrong. And our goal should be to move society as far left-wing as possible. Like destroy our ideological opponents, not rise above that, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ben O'Reilly. Not Ben O'Reilly.
Yeah, people are saying he's a bit of a libertarian. So again, there's some things I'm sure that I would 100% agree with Jesse Ventura about, but no, he's not my guy. Like Bernie Sanders is already an ideological compromise for me, right? Like Bernie's the compromise for the left, right? So.
And thank you to the admins right now who are helping our chat.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks guys for all of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so Ben Riley, clearly has a head for philosophy.
Yeah.
Should made the super chat comment. Bernie should have read. Oh, I can't say this.
Sun Tzu.
Sun Tzu's. I can do it. I just need a second. Sun Tzu's The Art of
Yeah.
War.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be certainly helpful for Bernie to understand that nature of politics. I feel like he had it. Again, I don't know if this would have made the difference, because ultimately, like, if like maybe because Clyburn would have never endorsed Bernie. Apparently Bernie didn't reach out to Clyburn, but I don't think there's anything Bernie Sanders could have said to Jim Clyburn for him to endorse Bernie. Jim Clyburn is is quite conservative, and opposes Medicare for all, calls it expensive free stuff.
Expensive free stuff?
Like, yeah, he's like, Americans don't want, like, it's too expensive. Americans don't want free stuff.
That's eloquent.
Yeah. In any case, we don't know if it would have ultimately worked, but to me, the lesson was clear. Joe Biden was tanking largely because Bernie hit him on Social Security. He tanked further because he had a bad result in Iowa, which means he had an even worse result in New Hampshire. His result in Nevada made it clear from my perspective that no one else was going to be able to touch Bernie except for maybe Bloomberg, because he didn't get bopped by Elizabeth Warren until I think after Nevada. In any case, Bernie should have spent much more time from Nevada onward. I know it was only a few days, but he should have spent that entire time hammering Joe Biden as hard as he could. And he didn't do that. He didn't do that. I've heard other arguments which are interesting. I don't fully agree, but I'm not necessarily 100% in disagreement either, that Bernie should have at some point, if only cynically, if only just as tactically, shifted away from the anti-establishment rhetoric and start to talk about the fact that he has, that his movement has now the majority in the party. And shifted away from we're fighting the Democratic establishment to basically saying we've beaten the establishment, come along with us. Like, and maybe, and some people have said that. Another thing is maybe doing more to associate Bernie Sanders as part of the Democratic Party tradition. That's been done. Bernie talked about FDR. AOC did the same, saying Bernie's bringing the Democratic Party back to the better parts of its history. But like, for instance, Bernie Sanders, I think after South Carolina, put out an ad of Barack Obama saying nice things about him. But that ad should have been playing back in 2019.
Yeah, long
like,
time ago.
Like, Bernie should have known that ad should have played earlier. And I think, so there's things he could have done to balance fighting the establishment with, like, I understand where you're coming from. And I think that's something he didn't necessarily balance. And again, Bernie was fighting the establishment, but frankly, maybe he needed to, like, lie to the Democratic base. We don't agree, but most people who vote in Democratic primaries like the Democratic Party. Bernie should have lied to those people about how he doesn't hate the establishment as much because he's changed them. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay. Ben O'Reilly again with the super chat. Just remember, how we play the game determines how the game is played. And I'm a programmer that studied social psychology, but philosophy is good too. No,
Ben, again, thank you so much for the support and the great comments and questions. No, you're right. Especially when you're at a level like Bernie. Like Bernie, again, he's just one player in the game. That's like, Warren's terminology. But when you're a front runner or the front runner, you can change the rules of the game. Like, if not the official rules, then the common sense by which the race operates. And maybe Bernie didn't do enough to do that, to shift the terrain in a more favorable position for him. Or maybe Bernie should have realized at moments where he couldn't have fundamentally changed it, that he should have shifted his tactics. Because again, there was probably going to need to be a point where Bernie stopped saying, I'm attacking the establishment, and start saying, come along with me to defeat Donald Trump. That's something he would have to do. Again, whether or not it's genuine, it's like the tactics.
Okay, we have another super chat, and it's from Catface. And there's no message, but there's a little symbol, and I think it can be interpreted as collectivism over individualism, or people over profits, or maybe communism over profits.
It's like a little. I'm not exact.
Hammer and sickle.
Yes, but it's, and then the other one is like the
money.
No, it's the justice bars. Like the scales.
Justice bars.
Well, like the scales, and they're balanced, like the old timey scales.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wrong.
So I think he's saying is that like a more transformative social justice is more important than textbook equality under capitalism. That's my interpretation. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it's your YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Okay. A left state of mind says, please do a whole thing where once a week you break down important things in Canadian history.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly something I would love to do. Whether it's like a weekly Canadian history thing, or it's a show like that. That's something I'm considering. Again, one thing I've talked about before on the channel is that I would love to find some way of scaling Canadian content. If you look when I do it or when David Dole does it, it just the views aren't there, and it does have algorithmic effects on the channel. I almost wonder if we could get some of the Canadian creators together to almost build something cooperative. Then you could pool audiences and make a channel focused on Canada. Maybe that's a better strategy. And like save these channels for like mostly American and global news and talk about Canada when the stories are really big, like, when there's an election or something. But, have a channel that's focused on Canada. And that's one of the reasons I want to start that podcast. So I could talk about Canadian history, Canadian politics, Canadian media, in a space that's explicitly designed for that. And again, the way podcasting works is that the funding model is more dependent on crowdfunding, right? Unless you have a really big one. Whereas YouTube, volume is more important. So it's like I have to consider those things too. But it's certainly something I would be interested in doing. And one thing is that after this lockdown is done and my son returns to childcare, the reality is I'll have more time to do my writing. And so I have a piece I'm working on. It should be published sometime next week on Jagmeet Singh and their response, and his response to COVID, and how he's he's the leader of the opposition because Andrew Scheer has done nothing of value in this crisis. But that's something that fits the writing model better than a YouTube video. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, Ben O'Reilly, one last super chat, says he's about to crash. Love you guys night. Thank you, Ben. We appreciate
Ben,
you.
thank you so much.
We appreciate you and all your support and your great questions that helps keep the chat going.
Yeah.
We also have another super chat from Maria Vargad. Yeah. And no question, but Maria, if you have a question or a comment, please leave it and we'll read it out. Thank you so much for your support.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much, Maria, for the support. Somebody says, is Canadian bacon really bacon? It's on the side there. What do you think?
Well, Canadian bacon is a type of bacon. It's pea-meal bacon. It's bacon. Yeah.
Brianna says Canadian bacon is bacon.
I believe it's the same cut of meat. It's just sliced differently.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That might be a hot take.
Yeah. A couple things here. Somebody said here, why are we angry at Elon Musk? Well, we're angry at Elon Musk because the man is like, reopen America, even though it's unsafe to do so, and working class people will bear the brunt of his irresponsibility, and how this is not anything new. But it's rooted in Elon Musk's deeply anti-union, deeply anti-worker ideology, and how Elon Musk is worried predominantly about his wealth and his business's stock prices more than he is about the health and safety of Americans. And in so doing, he's also aligning with like far-right Trumpers who are also irresponsibly calling for the economy to be reopened. Elon Musk is a bad man. And his family's wealth is rooted in the racist exploitation of the African peoples of South Africa, the black South Africans, and his family has never really answered for that exploitation. Elon Musk's a bad dude. He's a bad dude, and not in a good way. I'm not using bad there, good. Yeah.
Now I'm worried about the bacon question, because now I'm thinking that like all bacon is pork belly, and P-meal bacon cannot possibly be pork belly.
Yeah.
Okay, but we have some super
Yeah,
chats.
we'll get to, somebody said Elon's a union buster, yes. And then also, if you recall, Elon Musk did that podcast where he smoked marijuana with Joe Rogan. Now, I'm fine with that. I don't use cannabis products personally, but here in Canada, it's legal. And I've supported it being legal since I've been a teenager, just out of principle. But Elon Musk, after doing that, had a worker fired at one of his Tesla workplaces for testing positive for cannabis in their bloodstream. So it's good for Elon, but not any of his workers. So that's hypocritical as all hell. I didn't like that.
Okay, can we get to some super chats?
Yes, of course.
Now?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So John Barlich, have you heard about what Mitch said about how the states should go bankrupt? Does this affect his election, and who are his challengers?
So John, I have heard about this. So the broad story for those who didn't, I almost did a video about this, but the timing wasn't quite right. Mitch McConnell came out and said that we're going to oppose the blue state bailout. So he was referring to the COVID-19 aid money as bailing out the blue states, like New York, for instance. And he was basically saying liberal states have gotten the coronavirus, and they want us red state Americans to foot the bill. But then Andrew Cuomo, who generally I see as awful, made a good point and said, actually, when it comes down to it, my state, New York State, pays far more to the federal government than it gets back. Your state, Senator McConnell, gets more from the federal government than it pays into it through its taxes. And so, yeah, my phone is ringing.
That's you.
Yeah, that's my phone. And so the reality is that, who is it?
It says no caller ID, it's a scammer.
Is it a scammer? Did you enter it?
I hung up on them.
Oh, okay. So we should have answered it live. There's actually a lot of streamers now, and their whole stream is they like waste the time of
Sorry, I kicked the camera, everybody.
Yeah, they waste the time of those people. But in any case, what came after that was a lot of people talking about how, for the most part, blue states are net contributors to the federal treasury, and red states are generally net takers from it. And so it raised this really interesting question. Now, in terms of how this is going to affect McConnell's election, I'm not sure. The biggest factor for McConnell's election is that I think he's at risk given what we saw in the midterms. In the midterms, if we recall, Andy Beshear won that. The Democrats won the gubernatorial election in Kentucky. And that's important because a governor's race, like a Senate race, is statewide. Can't gerrymander them. Like, the state is what it is. So Mitch McConnell, hypothetically, will have to face the same electorate that voted for a Democrat over a Republican 2 years ago. And generally, midterm elections can be good for Republicans because young people are far more likely to turn out during presidential elections than they are midterms. And so if that's the case, and most young people are at least somewhat more likely to vote Democrat, Mitch McConnell could lose his seat. I'm not sure who his challenger is. I'm not that in tune to Kentucky senatorial politics. But I do know that if the Democrats can win the governor's mansion in Kentucky, at least hypothetically, there's a chance McConnell could be defeated. Then again, I wouldn't necessarily bet too much money on it. He could still win.
I'm still stuck on people are saying it's like cut from the back. So it's not. Someone suggested it's ham, but I don't think it is either.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay. Oh, we got so many more super chats. Hold on. Where are we? Tabasco K9 Academy with the super chat just says thank you.
It says tanks.
It says thanks. Thanks, we appreciate
Thank
your
you so
support,
much. Yeah.
Tabasco.
Unless you're saying tanks as in, like, are we having like a tanky discussion right now? Maybe, I don't know.
Are tanks like vroom vroom?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think maybe they're saying thanks. Well, in any case, we're going to interpret it as thanks, and we'll say you're welcome. You're welcome.
Oh, you're weird. Okay. Can you move your mouse so I can see
Oh,
the
yes.
person's name?
Yes.
Bose Einstein 7 with the super chat. And their question, Biden, based on the 25th Amendment, is already disqualified before presidency. So as Trump, why is Bernie technically not going forward with this? Oh, so is Trump. Same as Trump.
Yeah, I mean, the reality of impeachment or disqualification is purely political. Like, Trump was impeached by the House, obviously, over the quid pro quo with Ukraine, and we don't need to go over all of that. But from day one, you could likely argue that the emoluments clause was violated by Trump, that because he didn't separate himself from his personal businesses, he didn't do the blind trust, there was at least some evidence that he was using Trump properties, as part of this, and that foreign dealings that were friendly to Trump's business side were more likely to get friendly treatment by the American government. But ultimately, that's all determined by politics. No one has made a serious push to use the 25th Amendment argument against either Trump, and I don't know if you'll see it against Biden. It seems like that will take a lot to do. Now, I don't necessarily disagree that you can make a reasonable case to use the 25th Amendment, but again, it's more politics than anything else. Trump was clearly guilty of the Ukraine thing, and he should have been removed from office. Trump should not be president. But impeachment is purely political. The reason why Nixon was going to be impeached, like he was ultimately going to be removed from office, was because Republican voters called their senators and congresspeople and said, hey, we don't want this guy anymore. As long as Trump is very popular with the Republican base, he's going to be fine. And I guarantee you, if Biden wins, we won't like to hear this, but if Biden becomes president, most Democrats are going to be fond of him too. And he's not going to be removed from office as long as he's popular with his own party.
Okay, another super chat from Miranda Scott.
So yeah, it's like 25th Amendment only comes into play if you're assuming a just system. Well, that's the thing. Any impeachment proceeding, any tool of impeachment, any rationale for impeachment only works if you assume that everyone's acting in good faith. And no one is acting in good faith right now in that regard. Especially not the side that's being impeached.
Do you want me to read questions or do you want to host?
Well, no, it's just when I see something come by and it's like directly relevant, I want to like tag it on. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you can do that by yourself and I can go to bed. Okay.
Ooh, Brianna sass.
I know. I lost my place. Okay, Miranda Scott with a super chat. Ahoy. I'm from the US, but I'm moving to Canada this fall for university. Any suggestions on current politics or otherwise to look into? I just got my visa. Oh, that's so nice.
Well, that's great to see. Yeah, we're glad to have you here. Canada's a beautiful country. I mean, I don't know where you're going. So, what if you're interested in getting involved with politics, there's a few things. One, because you're coming to Canada and there are a lot of Americans here, there'll probably still be ways for you to be involved in American politics even while here. I know that on a lot of university campuses, there were a lot of Bernie groups, like organizing the Democrats abroad. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of those groups at least stay organized on a social basis to kind of like, as friends. So maybe reach out to people that were involved with Bernie stuff in Canada, especially if you're going to like I know here in Kingston even, we had Bernie groups, and I know in Toronto and all the big cities they had them. Generally, Brianna and I are involved with the NDP, and I would say that if you're a Bernie backer, you'd most likely find your home to be with the NDP, which is the kind of party of the Democratic social democratic left, and a lot of Bernie people there's a lot of Canadian people in that party that support Bernie Sanders. So look to get involved with your local NDP on your campus. That might be something to look at. And generally, as you won't be a citizen, you won't be able to vote in our elections. But in terms of getting involved in the party, you don't have to necessarily be a citizen to get involved in the party. Yeah.
No, that's right. And we hope that you enjoy your time. And Canada's a great place, and if you can travel, do that. Yeah, no, just glad to
Yeah.
have you. I'm excited.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to leave in the comments what university you're going to and what program.
Yeah, or no, for
Yeah,
sure.
that
If
would
you
be
feel comfortable,
if you feel comfortable.
or
I'm
even
just
just
now
which province or
interested.
something, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Okay. Anyway, I hope it goes. I hope it goes well.
Yeah.
Aldebert Red.
Adelbert.
Adelbert.
Yeah.
Adelbert Red upgraded their membership. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that support. Again, when you become a channel member, it's sort of like Patreon, but here on YouTube specifically. And, you know, you get your name on the end card and things like that. I don't know what tier, but Adelbert, if it's the highest tier and you'll get access to my Slack channel, be sure to send me an email. It's on the channel here, and I'll make sure you get the perks that are coming to you for that upgrade. So thank you so much for that.
Okay, so Jeannie McGraw with another super chat, and they say, how can I deprogram my friends from thinking socialism, Marxism is the same as Maoism or Stalinism? I bring up worker-owned co-ops. What else could I use?
Well, I think that's a good start, talking about co-ops, talking about how socialism does not necessarily have to mean total centralization within the federal government. Even when you talk about public ownership, you could talk about it on municipal levels. Talk about municipal broadband. Some cities, even in fairly conservative parts of the United States, are setting up their own broadband services to basically, because they technically there's multiple companies in the United States, but they've organized themselves in a way that there's only ever one or two companies that you can get services from, and they gouge the crap out of you because of it. And so some communities have set up their broadband because it's cheaper for their citizens. Their businesses get better quality internet at a more affordable price, which makes them more competitive and makes them more profitable, which means jobs are preserved and created. And I think that's just one example of what is in essence a part of a socialist project, which from my definition, socialism is three things. And I've talked about this on the channel. I'm not necessarily a pure believer that it's 100% worker ownership. You need three things to build a socialist society. One, universal guarantees of human dignity. Free healthcare, free education, guaranteed access to food and housing and all of those sorts of things. Any socialist society will have that. And it almost certainly has to be provided through the government. Two, you need the most crucial industries, the most strategic industries, to be owned by governments, to be owned by the people collectively. The most crucial strategic industries being owned solely by workers will make those workers privileged citizens over the other workers. That's my view. So for instance, the bankers as workers, you can't set up a workers' cooperative and have those people control the entire finance system. Whereas the people that work at McDonald's or other restaurants only have control over their jurisdiction. That's my view. So you need the commanding heights of the economy to be controlled by workers through the state, but that does not necessarily mean central ownership in the federal government. There's provincial ownership, there's community ownership, there's municipal ownership, and there is federal ownership depending on the thing in question. And finally, most industry, most workplaces should be cooperatives, worker and member cooperatives. And I think that's crucial. And I think what you should sell to people is the idea of economic democracy. Maybe this is a good entry point. Say to them, in our society, we would not tolerate autocracy. We would not tolerate a system where we didn't get to pick our president, or where the people who run the society can just willy-nilly change the rules, and fundamentally take away our human rights. Whether the system is fair, whether the system is just, it isn't. Everyone sort of gets the right to vote. And if you ask most Americans, you would say, I want a democratic society. But then, especially when you're not in a union, but even in unionized workplaces, when you go to work, your boss has immense power over you. They are effectively an autocrat. They can execute you economically. They can fire you. In the United States, in 49 of the 50 states, without cause. They do not need a good reason to fire you. They can just because they feel it. They can fire you, right? That's how it is. You have no rights. So why, in a society that praises democracy, should we tolerate private autocracy within the workplace? Working class people do not have freedom and democracy and opportunity until their basic needs are guaranteed and until they have meaningful input into their workplaces and into the wider economy. And that requires a combination, again, of universal access to all needs, worker ownership of small to medium-sized industry, and public ownership of large industry and strategic resources. That's my view of a democratic socialist society. And none of that necessarily entails Stalinism or Marxism or Maoism.
So do you think that's translatable for like an everyday person?
Well, that's why but the economic democracy is the entry point. You bring in the economic democracy. That's what I would say. You talk to people and you say, hey, you're in this society where supposedly you have the right to vote, but hey, do you get to elect your boss? Do you get to elect your manager? Do you get to vote on whether or not somebody gets executed from the workplace, aka fired? Do you get to vote on that? Why don't you get to vote on that? It's because private control of industry is fundamentally undemocratic. That's how you bring that in.
Okay, you could also tell them that social services like police and healthcare.
Yes, but see, that's complicated. If we're going to be honest, see, that's one of the disagreements I had with Bernie. Because Bernie does have actual socialism in his platform. He did. He had like transferring shares of companies to workers in the union, like gradually collectivizing worker owning the means of production. But for the most part, what Bernie's movement has been about is socialism equals social programs. My argument is any socialist society must have those social programs. I'm not a believer in a anarcho-socialist position where there's no state to provide collective benefits. Soviets alone will not take care of vulnerable people. You need a central system that ensures basic equality for everyone, a basic floor. You need a state to do that. That's my view. I have anarchist friends. They'll disagree with me there. That's why I'm not an anarchist. But that's not socialism on its own, right? That's not socialism. Socialism is worker ownership and democratic ownership of the means of production.
Oh, so Miranda is deciding between the University of British Columbia and the University of Victoria.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool. BC is great. It's wonderful. You'll love it there. And it hardly ever snows, but you're from Seattle, so you probably know that.
Yeah, so it's a, so if you're from Seattle, it's
and those
very
are good universities.
Yeah, they're great universities. Yeah. UBC is a beautiful campus. I haven't been to Victoria, but I was at the UBC last summer for an academic conference. It was fantastic. It was a beautiful campus. One thing, and if you want to get involved in left politics, the NDP is actually rather strong in both Vancouver and Victoria. Victoria municipal politics is very left-wing. I know Ben Izzet there, who's a colleague of mine. He's a fellow Labour historian, who's one of the more popular city councillors there. And so if you want to get involved with left politics, there's few places better than Vancouver and Victoria in Canada to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you're far left, there's also alternatives there too. It's a great place for left organizing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great. You'll love it there. That's wonderful. Okay. Maria Vargad, with another super chat. What do you think of the documentary Planet of the Humans by Michael Moore?
Okay, so Maria, thank you so much for that question. I'm going to be honest, I haven't seen it yet. And from what I've heard, it's extremely controversial. I've heard the concerns I've heard about, again, this is me sort of distilling what I've read about the movie. I have not seen it. So go see it before you take my word for it. But I've heard that the arguments in the film they're trying to argue that green capitalism is not going to be enough to save us. That simply, tax credits to green capitalists and things like that are not going to fundamentally change what's needed from an environmental or social perspective to ensure regular people are taken care of. right? In doing that, however, many people, and not just, and some people that I have a great deal of respect for, have suggested that it relies on certain tropes that are actually emanating from climate change deniers. That some of the data and facts they've used are more Koch brother than environmentalists left. And again, I have not seen the movie, but it's very divisive in that sense. I think I agree with their broad premise that green capitalism is not enough. We need eco-socialism. But it seems like the arguments they've made were if may risk actually empowering climate change deniers. And that's why the movie is really controversial. Again, I have not seen it. And so I have to at some point watch it and really dig in. But I've seen a lot of people that I respect and generally trust say some good things about the movie, but also say that it's a deeply problematic movie. So that's just as from my distillation of what I've heard.
Okay. So I'm gonna
also some people have said here. Christopher says here Malthusian arguments. There's some arguments that trend towards the overpopulation argument, which which I find generally to be a very bad argument, because it almost certainly leads to the idea that we need less Africans, even though like people in Africa use less carbon in a year than many Western people, even middle-class Western people, use in a month or something, right? Mm-hmm. When Brianna and I took a trip to London a couple of years ago, we don't travel a lot. We're not, it was a rare treat for us to actually go on a real trip. Mm-hmm. But when we did the carbon calculator, we found that one of our round-trip tickets was more than the entire carbon budget of a person in a developing African nation. So the argument that the world is overpopulated, I don't necessarily buy. Right? Or the conclusion of that argument gets into some ugly, ugly places potentially. So, yeah, I'm concerned about that particular. And I have and I won't even pretend to both sides that. That argument is bad to me. And the movie should have removed that argument if it wanted to be taken seriously by the left. But beyond that, before I comment, I don't want to, before I make a final decision, I want to watch the movie.
Yeah, why don't you watch it this weekend and then you can do a response or
maybe
something.
Maybe we could take a look, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read the last super chat that we have up. Yeah. And then I'm going to go to bed.
Okay, for sure.
So you can move your screen all the way to the top. Okay, Lisa Hildebrand. Oh, I love Lisa's questions. Okay, here we go. Lisa Hildebrand says, all in with Chris Hayes is discussing Tara Reade's sexual assault accusations against Joe Biden right now. Whoa.
Yeah, I mean, that's great to see. I mean, the story's been talked about more and more now. Now the problem is they're talking about it badly. And now Joe Biden and his people are lying about what the media is saying. Again, the previous video I did this afternoon on this story, where last night Stacey Abrams said the New York Times covered Tara Reade's claims and found they were not credible, which is actually not true. That New York Times piece was awful. It was awful. I talked about that. But the piece, to its credit, basically says we're not taking a side. We're not going to definitively say Tara Reade is telling the truth or she's not telling the truth. We're just saying we can't necessarily corroborate every one of her statements. Right? And so the Biden camp is lying about what the New York Times said, so much so that the New York Times came out today and said, actually, Biden's people are misrepresenting our reporting. Our reporting has not said that, right? And so I'm interested to see mainstream media cover it more, but I'm wary about the way they're doing it and the way that like Biden surrogates are going to be interpreting that news. It's like the Washington Post a couple days ago put out an article that said Trump allies are amplifying the story, as if to say it's like this story is only happening because Trump's talking about it, which is BS, because if anything, the reason this story is being covered is because of people on the left. Katie Halper, Ryan Grimm, they were the ones that, without them, like I couldn't even have done videos on them, because it was them doing the interviews and breaking the data with Tara Reade that allowed me to make my videos. So that was all from the left. But I'm interested to see if the coverage is really good. I don't know. Chris Hayes is probably one of the best people on MSNBC. He was fairer to Bernie than the other MSNBC people were. So I'm interested. I think that there's at least a chance when I watch it, he did a fair job. We'll see. Maybe I'm being optimistic.
Okay, put your thing all the way to the top.
Yeah.
Do you want water?
Yes, please.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
So Brianna's going to head out for the rest of the stream, but we are going to keep going probably till a little bit after 10. Last time we went to about 11. I usually go from like 10:30 or so. So maybe I'll go to about 10:15. Again, I was up a little early this morning, so I'm feeling a little tired. And I do want to check out this Chris Hayes interview when I have the chance, because if it's good, I might do a video on it. Well, it's interesting here. I'm going to kind of... Guy right here, Guy Julien says, I wouldn't say the Bloc Québécois is xenophobic, but it's true that it sometimes walks a fine line. But ultimately, I think the media is fueling the fire and the Bloc uses it electorally. I mean, I can see that as part of it, Guy. I think that in English Canada, we do often misunderstand Quebec, sometimes out of ignorance, sometimes out of malice. So... What we are reflexively calling xenophobic might be for you more nuanced. I still disagree. I think that some of the specific policies we've seen from the Parti Québec, from the CAQ, which the Parti Québécois also supported, and the Bloc also latched onto, are definitely xenophobic. And I think violate the basic human rights of Quebecers. Like, I think banning somebody from wearing a hijab if they work for the public service is a violation of the charter. It's only a matter of time. So I agree that sometimes we make mistakes in English Canada covering French Canada, but I still think that these laws are xenophobic. I do. So maybe it's fair to say that the Bloc Québécois is not inherently xenophobic, but some of its actions are xenophobic. Maybe that's fairer. Let me know. What are people saying? Comments are going quickly. I'm gonna try something different where I'm looking here. Just maybe I'll try to follow the stream more live now. I used to read from the back. I'm gonna see if I follow the stream live. Maybe I'll be a part of the discussion more. Matt Foley is not a fan of democratic socialism. That's okay, Matt. That's okay. Somebody, I think Thomas, you noted something. I thought you delete the comment, but you were saying that that Chris Matthews was sort of calling out his own channel. That's good to see. That's good to see. Chris Kaliza did that on CNN. Because it was Stacey Abrams went on CNN last night with Don Lemon and basically said the New York Times is saying Tara Reade's not credible. And then today, this afternoon, he wrote a piece about Stacey Abrams, where he was like, Stacey Abrams is stretching, at least she's twisting the truth to say that the New York Times is calling Tara Reade a liar, when the New York Times did not do that. They did not do that. Right? Well, Brandon C says, I've become a lot more socialistic due to coronavirus. I think a lot of people are feeling like that. They might not express it in clear ideological terms, but I think like more and more people support Medicare for all. More and more people realize that like people are unemployed now through no fault of their own. More and more people realize now that we're more interconnected and more dependent on each other than we ever thought. More and more people now realize how important like service workers, people who do deliveries and people who work at grocery stores are. I think there's an opportunity at least for the left after this. But there's also a risk that the right wing could seize on this by saying we spent so much money we have to cut services. So I'm worried about corona austerity if the left isn't vigilant after this is done. So saying like, oh, we wanted to do more, but because we spent all that money on stimulus, we actually have to cut healthcare and cut education for the next 5 years or whatever. Jared asks, somebody says, have you ever met CAQ party members? They're all garbage. I haven't met, I'm not in Quebec. I will say one interesting thing is that the Quebec premier is not somebody I generally agree with, but there was one time where he was asked, Quebec in the summer especially needs a lot of service workers, and they don't always have enough for their tourist industries. And so the Montreal or the Chambers of Commerce were complaining, and then the premier said, raise your wages, and they were so mad at him, and he's a conservative, but it was good to see him say raise the wages, because often I find that conservatives love supply and demand when it works for them, but then when there's a worker shortage, they'll refuse to acknowledge that maybe the reason people aren't taking that job is because the wages are too low, and like they have more choice. Yeah, Chris Hayes, sorry. Yes, not Chris Matthews. No, not Chris Matthews. Yeah, I've talked a lot about Chris before he got bopped and had to leave MSNBC. John Bartlett said, would I ever run for office? John, I've talked about this before. Thanks for the super chat, John. I've considered it. I might run one day for the NDP here in Canada. It will depend on where I'm at in my own life, where my wife is, where my son is. Is my riding one where the seat is available for the NDP to run in? But yeah, you could see me run one day. I'm not ruling it out, but it's not something that I'm immediately planning. Like I'm not like we're having a provincial election in 2022. I'm not planning to run in that, and I'm not planning to run in the next federal election either. But maybe in the next 10 years or so, who knows? There's a question here. Where did I get my? Joseph says, I heard Biden fell asleep during his live stream with Hillary. I need to look more into this. I mean, I've done some videos on Biden and his live stream kerfuffles, and those have been some of my better performing videos. So I'm obviously interested in that because maybe I'll make a video on that as well. But when I saw it, it very much does look like he fell asleep. But then I saw somebody extend the clip a little bit, and it might have been the case that he was reading his notes. And it still looks weird, but I'm not sure. I'm not 100%. This is not like when he rambles for 40 seconds, and it's very clearly like that he's having a cognitive decline incident. This I'm not sure. I have to look more into it. In general, though, I will say that I know most of us in this stream don't like Hillary Clinton, myself included, but when she did that live stream with Biden, you could tell the difference. Like Hillary Clinton, love her or hate her, she's sharp. The way, like, you could compare like how, because Hillary's in her 70s as well. So that's how like a healthy person in their 70s speaks versus Joe Biden. It exposed Joe Biden almost, even beyond the sleep thing. Somebody asked, I find it, yeah, Gerard Parker or Gerard Parker, I'm not sure. Where did you earn your PhD? From Queen's University in the Department of History. I did my dissertation on Pierre Trudeau, who's former Canadian Prime Minister, and his relationship to labor unions and the CCF-NDP. Yes, Stacey is seeding the air with lies. I mean, look, I think Stacey Abrams, I don't know if Biden's made his decision yet, but she is on the short list to be his VP. So it won't surprise me that, like, that she is doing what she can to ensure she's on the list. And going on the news and lying for Biden is probably something his VP is going to have to be doing a lot of between now and November. So maybe that was an audition. I don't know. John Barlich again says, hey, how is Corona affecting Canada? It's hitting us hard like it is in the United States. Like it is everywhere, but not as hard as the US. per capita, we have far fewer cases and far fewer fatalities. Bunch of reasons for that. One, we had better testing. Two, I'd like to think our universal healthcare system has played a big role. Three, we had our shutdowns happened earlier. Four, our shutdowns were more universal. Like, there's not a national order. Like, there's not a federal government ruling saying that all provinces must close, but every province fairly quickly declared like a state of emergency and and closed down businesses and schools. Whereas in the US, I know there's still some parts that didn't really do shutdowns and only did partial shutdowns, and it was county by county. And so I think that's a big factor. In Canada, like it is with the US, the biggest hits have been in old folks' homes, in long-term care facilities. In Canada, more than half the people that have passed away are from senior citizen homes or long-term care facilities, because you have older folks and you have people that are not that are not healthy. And when the virus got in there, it spread like wildfire, and the staff were getting it, and so the staff were going out sick, which means they didn't have enough staff. And so you combine that with their old people who are more vulnerable, and that's where most of the lost lives are in Canada, is in old folks' homes and long-term care facilities, predominantly affecting the elderly. So the effects have been massive. There's talks of a gradual reopening starting in the next few weeks, but it's really going to depend on where you are. Specifically in Montreal and Toronto, there's been some big effects. In some of the smaller parts, some of the smaller provinces, they've been less affected, and may be able to reopen sooner. John Barlett says, again, John, just firing them off. Thank you so much. John, he says, do you think Ivanka Trump will run for president? And what do you think about her? I don't know what to think. I mean, I'm not a fan. She seems like she's polished. I remember when the Republican convention where Trump officially became the nominee in 2016. I remember her giving a speech and it sounded fine. I do think she's going to run for president. I do. I really do. Guys, I've talked about this before. I can honestly see, like, maybe it's, I don't want this, but I could see it happening where it's like Chelsea Clinton versus Ivanka Trump. I could see that happening. God help us all. I could see that happening. Holly Edgecombe says, will Hillary push Biden out and take over? There's some talk that she's crafting her return. I don't know what Hillary's strategy is. I see that as unlikely. I see, like, if Biden is forced out, like, it should be Bernie, let's be honest. Bernie's clearly the second choice. But the party's not going to want that. I honestly think, like, you're more likely to see Cuomo than Clinton. Hillary Clinton is still very unpopular, and I don't think the party wants to go back to Hillary. You'll see other people get a shot before her. Like, I think they'd rather go with Kamala Harris than Hillary Clinton. Yeah, Sinistoria says, PhD from Queen's, postdoctoral fellow at U of T. Postdoc's now wrapped up, but those were my recent affiliations, yes. James Wheeler, did you hear that Mark Cuban, who's a former Ayn Rand libertarian, is now a Bernie Sanders progressive, plans to run third party? I didn't hear the second part. I knew the first part, that Mark Cuban was a staunch libertarian, and that he sort of rejected it over the last little bit, at least, because of what he's been seeing. And I did hear that when the coronavirus really hit and it started hitting the sports leagues, he was the first owner, I think, in any of the sports to make a commitment to help take care of the concessions workers, like the hourly minimum wage workers that keep the sport possible. And so my respect for him grew a little bit. He's still a billionaire, but like I saw that as a character move. I didn't know he was identifying as a progressive now, and I didn't know about a third party run, so I have to look into that. So FemiBot says, can I please read your dissertation? Certainly. Let me just do a quick check. The dissertation itself, Q space. The dissertation itself was embargoed because I was making it into a book. So if you, let me do a quick look here. I don't know if it's open yet. If it's open, yeah, it's not open yet. I think it's because of that. But if you go to this link, let me know if this link works. If you go to this link, you have a request form to access my dissertation. You can send me an email. But if you want to read the more polished version, you can purchase my book, The Constant Liberal. I'll post a link to that. It's basically similar, but it's a more polished and succinct version. And so here's just a link. You can purchase it from multiple places, but here's the book itself. But they're similar, so you can access that. Send me that link. I have it embargoed because that's what you need to do when you publish your book. But when people send a request to me to read the dissertation, I'm happy to send it to them. So, and thank you for the support, Femi. Samantha Sider saying that she doesn't mind being called out about having an electric car, but getting the population control stuff is very sketchy. I can see that. So I do want to check out the film, but at the very least, it's very controversial. And I know I've seen some of you talk about how, like, even amongst progressives, even amongst the left, there's a real concern with the movie. So it's something that I really want to get right, because I like Michael Moore, and I know he's a Bernie guy, so I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. But I'm not going to cover for somebody who did a bad thing. I know he didn't make the film directly, but his name is attached to it. And I want to, he has a responsibility. Julie McGraw says, do you think libertarianism is kind of dead because of COVID-19? I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot of people that are using libertarian imagery and arguments to oppose the lockdowns, so maybe not. I certainly think it's dormant, but I don't think it's going away. I think the libertarians are going to run their candidate, and they're going to get, the couple percent they normally get. But I'm not sure. I think some people will be convinced that libertarianism would have utterly failed in this sort of crisis. On the other hand, some people might not have been comfortable with the lockdown and think the solution is becoming a libertarian and fighting government restriction. Paolo says, how likely is a UBI in Canada or in one of its provinces? Do you see very dark time in Canada after COVID-19 crisis and very low oil prices? In terms of provincial UBIs, I mean, I think if it's going to happen, it'll likely be federally, because the costs are going to be high and the federal government has more revenue. I think if you're going to do it, it's going to have to be a federal thing. I really think so. And it'll be hard too, because if you make it only provincial, you'll have to worry about people moving provinces. So if somebody moves into your province, which you're allowed to do, you can't restrict provincial citizenship. Canadians, once you're a Canadian citizen, you can live in any province you want. Like, how do you determine who qualifies for the UBI? I think nationally would be the far better way. I don't think you're going to see a permanent UBI. I think you're going to see the idea be more popular, but ultimately I don't see it being implemented in the short to medium term. But politicians that support the idea are going to get more support than they did before, because we're doing something along the lines of a UBI. It isn't universal enough. The NDP wants to make it universal. But we're doing something like it that's going to give the credence to the argument, hey, during this crisis, something like a UBI is one of the reasons why Canada survived the crisis. We need to look at this as a more permanent thing. And maybe we're not there yet, but the argument is going to be further along. In terms of, dark times for Canada, I mean, yeah, oil prices are, as a petroleum exporting country, especially in the western provinces, oil prices being low are bad for the economy. It could hurt certain regions and certain communities very, very hard. But I don't know if there'll be dark times in Canada. I mean, the Canada's debt to GDP ratio is still fairly good, and I'm not necessarily convinced that we are heading towards dark times. Now, there is the chance that the Liberals and Conservatives will use the debt increase because of the stimulus package as an excuse to fight pharmacare and dental care and the things we still need to do. And that's something I'm cognizant of. So I'm worried about that a little bit, but that's sort of speculation at this stage. John asks, is there any political figure that you disagree with that has genuinely supported a policy you like, could be Canadian or American? I mean, sure, there are politicians in the United States that support a $15 minimum wage, but then also don't support Medicare for all. And there are politicians in Canada that support some of the things I support, like legalizing marijuana or a woman's right to choose, but I don't agree with them on other things. So there's lots of politicians like that. So, they're like sometimes the Liberal Party in Canada or the Green Party. On certain issues, I agree with them, but on the core issues, I often disagree. And same thing with moderate Democrats or people like Joe Biden. Like, there are certain things that I agree with Joe Biden, but not on the most important issues, I feel at least. WJ says Joe Biden's not going to pick Stacey Abrams. It's clear Clinton will be his running mate. I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be Clinton. I'm not saying it's impossible. I don't want to say that because then it's going to happen, and you guys are going to just roast me on the next live stream. But I think the real contenders, Kamala Harris, Gretchen Whitmer, Amy Klobuchar, Stacey Abrams, and I don't see her as really a contender, but she's on the list, Elizabeth Warren. I really feel like it's going to be one of those five. I'm actually leaning towards Klobuchar for a couple of reasons. One, she's a moderate like Biden. So because we know Warren betrayed the left, but she's still too far left for Joe Biden. The party establishment still really wouldn't want Liz Warren as president. I don't think they would. They would choose her over Bernie 100%, but they don't want Warren as president because she wants a wealth tax, for instance. And that wouldn't be good for the rich and wealthy and well-connected at the DNC. Nancy Pelosi couldn't afford all of that ice cream if there was a wealth tax. Maybe she couldn't afford two freezers full. But I think he's leaning towards Klobuchar. She's a moderate, and she's from the Midwest, and the Midwest is where the Democrats will win or lose this election. That's where it's going to be. You don't need another person in their 70s from Massachusetts, somebody who finished third in their own state, like Elizabeth Warren. It's going to be Klobuchar, I think, is who I'm leaning towards as the number one pick right now. Paolo asks, are you worried about Alberta moving further away politically from the other provinces due to low oil prices? Thank you for your videos. Paolo, thanks for the thank you. I mean, I'm not sure. It's interesting what's happening in Alberta. After the last federal election, as you guys recall, for those Americans who maybe didn't follow the Canadian election, but what happened was the Conservative Party, which is sort of like ideologically, they're more like right-wing Democrats, moderate Republicans, because our conservatives aren't as far right as most of the Republican Party. It's just we have a more left-leaning spectrum. But they actually got more votes than the Liberal Party did. but they did very, very well in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And they didn't do as well in Ontario and Quebec. And so the Liberals got less votes, but their votes were better spread out. Sort of like what happened with Trump. He didn't win the popular vote, but he was able to spread his vote out in swing states and win. And whereas Clinton built up huge wins in California and New York that were wasted. And so conservatives in Alberta and Saskatchewan started talking about Wexit, which is Western exit. And whether or not it would ever work, it probably wouldn't. There was a real discontent from the Western provinces. Also a little bit in Manitoba, but not as much. It was mostly Alberta and Saskatchewan. Both of those provinces have fairly conservative provincial governments too. I'm not sure what the low oil prices will do. I think there's a chance that, Jason Kenney has done a really bad job in Alberta, I would say. And there's a chance that he could get blamed for all of this happening, whether it's fully his fault or not. And much like how Rachel Notley couldn't really do anything about the low oil prices, maybe Jason Kenney can't either. And maybe they'll get turfed and the NDP will be back in 2023, I think. 2023 is the next provincial election in Alberta. And I think that could certainly happen. 2024 maybe, I'm not sure. Brandon's asking how many cases we have in Canada. COVID-19 Canada. Okay, Canada cases. Okay, yeah. Okay, so cases in Canada, we have 51,000 cases, and 5152 with about 3,000 people who have lost their lives. Now, per capita, you have to remember, Canada has about 10% of the population of the United States. So, for reference, Canada, if we were comparing Canada to the US, we should have if you guys were the same, if you guys wanted to have the same amount as us, you guys would have about 500,000 cases, and you guys would have about you guys would have about 30,000 deaths. So put it another way, the United States is doing about twice as worse as Canada. You guys have 20 times more cases or so, and about 20 times more deaths. You guys should have 10 times more of each. So that's what's happening there. So John asks, who do you think will run in 2024? I mean, it depends on what happens, right? If the Democrats win, then I think either Biden's going to run again or Biden will step aside for his VP. And I think while there'll technically be a nomination, that VP will be in a very good position to win the nomination. If Biden loses, then I think you're going to see Warren run again. You're going to see, you might see Cory Booker, Kamala Harris run again. You might see, you might see like a Rashida Tlaib type run. I'm not exactly sure yet. I don't think you'll see Bernie run in 2024. I don't think that'll happen. Sinistoria was saying, I'm going to bed like Brianna. Yeah, like Environmental Canadian makes a good point. The U.S. has 4% of the population of the world, but 20% of the cases. It's certainly not ideal. On deaths, they're doing a little bit better. They have about 28% of the world's deaths and 33% of the world's cases. But, I mean, that's still not great. Obviously, because they you know. I mean, Thomas Fillion says one of the reasons that people are against socialism is welfare. And it's a system per child creating what might be recognized as the welfare queen. Is this true? Well, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I mean, look, In a society as big as the United States or Canada, where you either have 35 million people or 330 million people, you can find some people who will abuse social assistance. But the question is, how prevalent is it, and does it happen enough that it actually matters? And I would say that, as we've seen in Canada and the United States, there's far more corporate welfare than there is welfare to individuals. And corporations are far more likely to abuse the aid they've gotten from the taxpayers and lie about it than regular poor people who get social assistance. And so my view is that, good social programs will take care of people. And there is a chance from time to time some people will abuse the access to the programs. They will take money they're not entitled to, or they'll have money and they won't use it to take care of their children. They'll use it for their vices. That probably happens. But on the whole, most of the money that goes to poor people actually helps poor people. And most poor people use their money responsibly. And most people that are on social assistance are trying to find work and would rather work. And so I would say that if you're worried about welfare, worry about billions and trillions of dollars going to the richest and wealthiest corporations. And I mean, let's also be real that even middle class people in the United States, you guys get to write off your mortgages. Like, Americans get to write off the interest on their mortgages, I believe, which is a huge gift to people lucky enough to own homes. That's worth more than food stamps. So when you look at who gets the most social aid in the United States, it's not the poorest people. It's actually middle-class people in some ways. Because, yeah, they don't get food stamps, but they get, various tax breaks specifically aimed at middle-class people. So the welfare queen meme is explicitly racist. It was intertwined with the idea of poor black single mothers, and it was largely a fiction created by the Reagan Republicans. Craig asks about Bryce Belden and or TrueAnon. I don't know much about them, Craig. I have to look more into it. Off the top of my head, maybe it's just I'm tired, but I can't. Is TrueAnon a left guy? I know most people that go by Anon are generally conservative. Like Anon, I associate that discourse with 4chan, right? So. It's the argument we often talk about, but the argument is who pays the most taxes? And you'll hear it from conservatives in Canada and the US that it's rich people pay so much of the taxes. But when you actually look at the data, there was a report that came out just before the Canadian election. I don't know if I made a video about it or if I talked about it, but there was a report that said it may be the case in Canada that the poorest people pay the highest percentage of their income in taxes when you factor in sales taxes and other things like that. And that the richest people, because wealth isn't taxed and capital gains are only taxed at 50% of their value, the richest people might actually pay the lowest amount in taxes. On the face of it, it looks like they're paying a lot because their highest bracket of income tax is so much higher than the lowest bracket. But effectively, they're paying such a small part of their income is actually wages. Most of it comes in other sources. John Barlidge says, have you heard ALC will run on the New York Senate to take on Schumer? I haven't. I've heard rumors. I'm not sure if that's going to happen. I mean, I think I would like that. I think she would be a great senator, and it would be great to have her in the Senate. I don't know if it's not going to happen this time because the primaries are soon. I think AOC could plan a Senate run. And I think if she's going to want to be president someday, maybe jumping from the Senate will be an easier move. So she can become a senator and then be a senator for a full term and then run in 2028 or 20 or something. And that could work out really well. Maybe run for Senate in 2022. But I haven't heard anything official about that. Paolo says, are you planning or already have some videos on the long-term political impact of the COVID crisis? I'm a big fan. Thank you again for your videos. Paolo, thank you for the comments again. I haven't necessarily done any of those videos. One, like, they're very long-ranging, and I have to think about that stuff, but also I'm not an expert. And I usually try to have my commentary rooted in something I have a good knowledge of. And that doesn't mean that I won't comment on things with an educated layperson's perspective. But when it comes to like the long-term effects of COVID, especially as it pertains to medical issues and the science, I am expressly not qualified to comment. And so even the scientists aren't sure, then I don't want to make comments. So it's a mixture of, it's a big undertaking that I would need to, give a lot of time to, but it's also something that I don't necessarily feel comfortable doing until I know a lot more, Yeah, Joseph makes a great point. Biden supporters saying now's not the time to talk about policy. Now's especially the time to talk about it, especially if we think that, Biden adopting good policy will be essential to actually electing progressives and defeating Trump. I think now's the time you talk about it, right? Like, and we're in a moment now where reality is proving Bernie Sanders' platform to be correct, right? And I think that's crucial. And as Joseph notes, it's like when you talk about like, gun violence, right? And people will say, some tragedy will happen at a school or a Walmart somewhere in the States. And then people will bring up gun issues. And whether or not, I know not everybody on the left supports gun control, but whether or not you do, like the argument from the right is that now's not the time to talk about this. Let's talk about it when we've forgotten about it. Right? You know what I mean? That's like the argument. Well, Matt Foley makes a point. Free college tuition is an oxymoron. If somebody is getting the education, someone is paying for it. Well, of course, Matt, 100%. But the issue is that, even if it's not free, we have to look at the context of how educations used to be far more affordable and have far more value back in when our parents were younger. The educations were not necessarily free, but the schools were better funded through public money. And so what's happened in Canada is we don't really have private universities. We have some, but all of Canada's top universities are public. They're all public institutions. But what's happened is that over the decades, more and more of the money to run those universities is coming from donations and from tuition. And less of it as a percentage is coming from direct government transfers to the universities. And so what's happened in essence is, as you note, someone's always got to be paying for it, is that we've taken what was a collective investment in society and we've farmed that out on an individual basis. And I don't know if that's necessarily the best way to do it. Certainly you're right that these services have to be paid for. But the question is it a just or efficient way to pay for it on an ad hoc basis? John asks, do you think if Biden was elected as president and then later on had to use the 25th Fifth Amendment on him, how would that affect U.S. politics? I mean, like, it would be a major... Well, anytime a president is impeached, even if they're not removed, it's a big deal. Like, Trump's impeachment had a big effect on American politics, I think. It was a historic event. Most likely what would happen is that the use of these amendments would be politically motivated. If, however, it was so serious that even the Democrats agreed and he was removed of office via the rationale of the 25th Amendment, which is basically that he's unfit for office, his mental health is so bad that he can't do the job, I mean, I think it would have a lot of debates about the role of like, how do you classify these things? How do you bring this up without being ableist? How do you balance the need to ensure that older Americans have their rights respected without, having a president that can't do the job? I think that it will have a lasting effect on older candidates that want to run. Again, Bernie, and I didn't like him, but Michael Bloomberg and Bernie Sanders, when you listen to them compared to Biden, were far sharper than Biden, and they're all essentially the same age. Bernie, Bloomberg, and Biden are all within a year and a half of one another. So it's not just about age, but I think that if like an older president gets elected in their late 70s and then gets removed from office using the 25th, I think that's going to discourage a lot of people from supporting older candidates in the future, whether that's fair or not. The U.S. should invade the U.S. and try to win the hearts and minds of our citizens. Bluebell 51, that's a great comment. I mean, look, the only thing that can really defeat America is America. Like, no other country is going to invade the United States, not in this global context. And so what's going to ever defeat the United States is its own internal strife driven by incompetence, inequality, injustice. Like, that's what's going to destroy the United States. But it also means that if the United States could really, get it together, then it could become a truly great society. Not just great in the sense that the rich people in the United States are rich and that the government has a lot of military weapons, but that it could be a society where, the working class people really have like a good standard of living. I mean, the United States, if it wanted, could have all the things that Sweden has, and Finland and Norway. Hundreds of millions of people could have that. Yes, Samantha Sider notes, every day I fear of losing my healthcare during this pandemic. Certainly. I mean, look, it's bad enough that people worry about getting COVID-19, and it's bad enough that they worry about losing their job, but it's especially bad knowing that, like, I lose my job, I lose my health coverage at a moment where everyone's getting sick. And I know there's like this talk about how there's provisions to help people who get sick with COVID, but I don't buy that. People are going to end up owing money somewhere on the line, even if it's said that it's covered. And it's even if you don't get sick from COVID, you lose your job because of COVID. And what happens if you find out that like you get cancer, or you're pregnant and you lose your job, or your spouse loses their job, and now you have to cover the medical costs of the birth? It's a mess. It's a mess. Well, I've seen Matt Foley says like Bernie's platform is unworkable in the U.S. Eventually, it disincentivizes the taxpayers from footing the bills for all the free stuff. House of Cards collapse. Again, I'm not sure I agree. Like, there are other countries that have done everything that's in Bernie's platform. And I certainly think that the United States has an immense amount of wealth. It's a wealthy society. And so I think that it could certainly provide all of these things. And some of the things in Bernie's platform were effectively provided. Like free education. Sure, university wasn't free in the 60s and 70s. But tuition was like hundreds of dollars at most in some of these universities. Like, if it wasn't free, it was accessible to most people. And I think that like that's something that you could get to. And some of the things Bernie's proposing are things America has done before, right? And there are things that poorer societies have done. Canada, as per capita, our GDP is a little bit lower than yours, right? Like the United States has so many, our poor people are better off than your poor people. But the United States has so many billionaires and millionaires that you guys have more money per person there. So if Canada can afford something, so can the US. And you guys have more people. and you have a higher population density, which means you should be able to provide services on higher economies of scale than we do. John says, hey, I'm going to head out. When do you think America can get universal healthcare? And your thought on police brutality in America? I mean, I think police brutality is an issue everywhere. It's an issue here in Canada, too. Against African Canadians, against Black Canadians, but largely in Canada, the biggest group of victims are Indigenous people, what you guys might call Native Americans. We call them Indigenous people in Canada. And that's a big issue. In places like Winnipeg and Thunder Bay, it's a major issue. The police I don't know if they still do it, but up until recently, the police would often take Indigenous people on like minus 50-degree nights, drive them out to the country and leave them there to freeze to death, essentially. That was a thing. They called them starlight walks or something, or moonlight walks. Police brutality is a fundamental issue on both sides of the border. And it's totally inappropriate, and there needs to be greater consequences for officers that engage in it. 100%. In terms of universal healthcare, I'm not sure. I'm not sure when it's going to happen. My hope is that this drive, the COVID-19 case has made Medicare for All more popular. Whether that sustains after the crisis is over, and that maybe by 2024 it can be on a presidential ticket, I'm not sure. But the interest in it is rising. See, Buffalo says, if Bernie was my dad, I'd probably be a millionaire Marxist career politician's son. But see, that's not really true, though, because I believe, and let me look this up. Okay, Levi, Bernie, and Endorse. Okay, so back in 2018, and this is a direct refutation of your argument. This is from Vox. I know not the best source, but it's a factual statement. Bernie Sanders won't endorse his son's run for Congress, citing dynasty politics. Sanders isn't typically frugal with his endorsements, except for when it comes to Levi Sanders, his son, who's running in New Hampshire. So just to underline, Bernie Sanders will not endorse his own son because he does not believe in dynastic politics. So I would have to say, Matt, that literally the exact opposite is the case. That your idea that Bernie you'd be the son of privilege. Bernie Sanders would not endorse you specifically because he was your child, or you were his child. Now, I dropped the link in the description there. Yeah, Dan Corbertine, the last residential school closed in the 1990s. I can look that up. I know the Blue Jays, the last residential school closing was after the last Blue Jays World Series. Last closed residential school was in Saskatchewan, the Gordon Indian Residential School in 1996. So I was 9 years old at the time, thereabouts, depending on when it was in the year. I was born in 87. Now, to be fair, by then, most residential schools were closed. I think the peak was more in the 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever. But they were running at least until the 1990s. Hypothetically, then, I am old enough that I could have gone to a residential school, because hypothetically, if you get sent off at 5 or 6 or whatever, I would have been 5 or 6 in like 1992, 1993. If I was from that area, and if you're about my age or a couple years younger even, you could have been at a residential school still. It's still very much a part of a direct legacy. And that's in addition to the people, much more common, people who are now older, people who are 50, 60, 70, at a time where residential schools were far more common. Yeah, no, the First Nations Canadians have had a real tough go. I mean, it's incredible. And same thing in the United States. And they get more attention in Canada because our indigenous people are more likely to live in urban areas than they are in the United States. And as a percentage of population, indigenous people are about 5% of Canada. They're less than the United States. So it's a bigger proportional issue here, but it's Canada's fundamental social injustice is the treatment of indigenous peoples, historically and still today. And it's something that, frankly, all political parties have failed, even the NDP, my own party. And I'm a very big supporter of our party, but our party, like all the other colonialist parties, has utterly failed indigenous people. I'd like to think that at times we've been better, but frankly, we've never been good enough. Thomas Fillion has become a member of the channel. Thomas, thank you so much for that. Thanks for becoming a new member and an ongoing supporter of the channel. I very much appreciate it. Sean says, Christo, do you know why Canada doesn't have stats on which demographics have been most hit by COVID like the US has released? That's a great question. Frankly, at least on the provincial level here in Ontario, they're not tracking it. The Ford government's making the BS excuse that it doesn't see race, basically. And so what the NDP and what a lot of groups that represent Indigenous people and Black Ontarians have been saying is, we want to know if COVID-19 is having a disproportionate effect on our communities. What we've seen in the United States, and of course it doesn't necessarily mean it's the same here, is that in general, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and Black Americans have been disproportionately likely to be affected by COVID-19. Whether that's because there's poor health and safety in their communities, whether that's because their medical treatment isn't as good, whether that's because people in those groups are disproportionately more likely to be low income and in the sorts of jobs that can't isolate, like you don't have the option to work from home. We don't know necessarily, but it's certainly having a racial dynamic. And we assume similar in Canada, but we don't have the data to prove it, at least not in Ontario. And I think that's one of the reasons. They're not collecting the data. All My Lettuce says, I made it. Back from work. Great to see you, All My Lettuce. Great to have you here. To see ya. Great to see. Okay, Junie McGraw. Do Canadians deal with crippling college debt like Americans? To a certain degree we do, but not to the same extent. I believe, now somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, when I graduated from university in 2009, from my undergrad, I had about $18,000 of debt. Now I had some parental support a little bit, and I had some student loans, but I also had scholarships and some grants because I was low income. And I ended up with about $18,000 of debt when I graduated undergrad. And my graduate school was paid for through research grants and things like that. So basically, I had $18,000 for all three of my degrees. The average for a bachelor's, I think at the time, was more in the mid-20s. So I was a little lucky because I had some scholarships and stuff. I know that's significantly lower than a lot of Americans, but it's still a major issue in Canada. Education is getting more and more expensive for Canadians, and a lot of people go into heavy debt for it. And it is a barrier to access. But most universities are tuitions lower than a lot of U.S. schools. So crippling, not for everybody, but a lot of Canadians deal with very, very heavy student debt loads, which, like Americans, make it difficult for you to buy a home or start a life or have a family or you start saving for retirement and things like that. All My Lettuce. My God, what an awful choice. He's like, I'm here. Let's give you a tough question. Eco-fascism or socialism, but nobody believes in climate change? Socialism, but nobody believes in climate change. Honestly, no, I would never support fascism. I don't know. Typical Canadian says, I think Indigenous Canadians didn't get to vote until around 1960 or so. I could be wrong. In general, you're right. There were a few exceptions. The way it worked in Canada was actually going back to early days in Confederation. Indigenous people could vote. Indigenous men could vote if they renounced their Indian status. When I use the word Indian there, I'm not using it as a slur. It's official legal term. If you're an Indian under the Indian Act, you have access to like reserves and things like that. And certain benefits that like settler Canadians don't have. But you were also considered a ward of the state. Effectively, you were like, the state was like your parent. And you were often not allowed to leave your reserve without permission from the government. But if you renounced your Indigenous status and you renounced your claim to your Indigenous like life, then you could become enfranchised. And so when Indigenous people did that in the early years of Canada, and they met property qualifications, because in some parts of Canada in the late 18 and early 1900s, you had to be a man of a certain age and you had to own a certain amount of property, you could vote, even if you were racially Indigenous, but you had to renounce your legal status as an Indian. After, I believe, World War I, but certainly World War II, Indigenous men that served in the military could have both their status and their right to vote. But in general, it wasn't until the 1960s that all Indigenous people, men and women, could effectively vote. That's around the time, yeah. So in general, you're right. Rita says, thank you for your channel, Christo. I live in Alaska. Oh, that's great to see. Great to have somebody here from Alaska. Hope the weather is nice there right now. Say hi to Sarah Palin for me. Yeah, Comrade Internet makes a good point that like maybe the racial data isn't being collected because they know the data is going to look bad. So if they don't collect it, they can play dumb. I don't think that's an unreasonable claim, Comrade Internet. Bluebell says, I heard from relatives on the reserve in North Dakota that a reserve in Manitoba asked for help from the government and was sent 1,000 body bags. That's true, but not for this crisis. That was for the SARS crisis in the early 2000s, where the government basically let some Indigenous communities in Manitoba just deal with it by burying your dead. That did happen, and it was a gross injustice. This time, actually, in Canada, Indigenous people on reserve, Indigenous communities have done a great job because the government does fuck all for them. Sorry, I try not to swear, but it's true. The Trudeau Liberals would have let them all suffer because they don't really care about Indigenous people. But Indigenous communities made the decision to basically close their borders. They basically set up blockades on their reserves, and a lot of reserves did this all across Canada, basically saying no one's allowed in unless they're a member of this community or they're bringing in an essential good or service. And because of that, the feared outbreaks in Indigenous communities didn't happen. We worried about it because, one of the things you're supposed to do is wash your hands frequently. But in a lot of Canadian Indigenous communities, they have systematic failure of clean water access, which is terrible if you need to wash your hands a lot. So the feared Indigenous outbreak on reserves didn't happen. And we were very happy to see it. Yeah, let me look. I can maybe find a link here about the body bag thing. SARS body bag. So if I look that up, SARS body bag. Okay, so this was here. Aboriginal leaders are horrified that some of the reserve's hardest. This also goes back to this is for the swine flu, September 16th, 2009. I'm gonna post a link in the thing here for you guys. And I'll just read it out for people who can't click the link. It says here, Ottawa sends body bags to Manitoba. This is the CBC, so it's a credible source. Aboriginal leaders, this is back when we still use the word Aboriginal. We use Indigenous now. Aboriginal leaders in Manitoba are horrified that some of the reserves hardest hit by swine flu in the spring have received dozens of body bags from Health Canada. The body bags, which were sent to the remote northern reserves of Wassagamak and God's River First Nation, came in a shipment of hand sanitizers and face masks. Grand Chief David Harper, who represents First Nations, says body bags send the wrong message, and no one can understand why Ottawa would do such a thing. So yeah, they sent some supports, but mostly it was like this acknowledgement, like here's our support, things to bury your dead. So it's not, that hasn't happened with COVID, but it did happen in the 2000s. Yeah. So yeah, it's true, but not this time, at least yet. Yeah, that's a great point, Comrade Internet. Thanks for reminding me. And because there was going to be a worry about systematic breakouts in Indigenous communities. Thank goodness it didn't happen. But Cuba was offering to send doctors specifically to work with Indigenous communities in Canada, because Cuban doctors are global heroes, and they especially work with populations that are marginalized because they're heroes. And the Canadian government refused the aid of Cuban doctors because the Liberal government, Chrystia Freeland's grandfather was a anti-communist white nationalist fascist back in World War II. Can't say that's the reason, but it's more than a coincidence, maybe. It's more than a coincidence. So yeah, that's another factor, but we're glad that it hasn't happened on the reserves. We're really glad, because that would have been another devastation. These communities already go through so much, right? There's a lot of youth that end their lives by suicide in these communities. There's people die young. Some of them deal with, again, systematic clean water shortages. A lot of them deal with mercury poisoning. Yeah, you don't want to add COVID to that, right? Because again, COVID preys on those that are already weak, right? I'm not like, I don't want to, if you could be young and healthy and die from it, right? Like, that's happened, but for the most part, it hits old people, sick people, the hardest, homeless people, things like that. I haven't read Paul Beckwith, Environmental Canadian. I haven't read them. Maybe I have, but off the top of my head, I can't think of that. Bluebell brings up here, that's the problem with the Navajo and Pueblo nations. No running water. They have to bring in outside water because their water was contaminated with uranium tailings. Yeah, like in Canadian reserves, there's similar things. I don't know if it's uranium related in any of them, but there's, whether it's because of industry or just because of when Indigenous communities were forcefully moved out of the way to make way for white settlers, in the 1800s, but also even since World War II, they were often moved to places that had really, really poor conditions, and there wasn't always a factor being given to whether or not the land was good for farming or the water was good for drinking. So, guys, this was great. I'm probably going to wrap up. It's about 10:30. Again, I told people I got up at 5:45 today to do 3 hours of CBC radio. So I'm a little exhausted. And I'm going to probably finish it right now. For those who are new to the channel, I don't know if there are a whole lot of new people that come onto the streams, but if you're new, I do these every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. We usually go to about 10:30 or so. Sometimes I do bonus streams, but mostly I do once a week. I post about a video a day, or 2 videos a day, usually on the channel. Sometimes 1, sometimes 3. So keep that in mind that we're a daily posting channel. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by going to Patreon. There's a link in the description, or joining the channel here. But of course, the best way to support the channel and the way that I understand everyone can do, even if they don't have a lot of money right now, is to watch my videos when they come out. When you guys watch a new video when it comes out, it really helps the channel. So if you want to make a daily habit of every day coming to the channel, going directly to the channel page and watching the new videos, that would really help the channel out. And beyond that, I just want to say thank you for your support. You guys were very generous with your super chats and your time tonight. And this was a lot of fun. And I know Brianna, she had to leave a little early, but Brianna has a lot of fun doing these as well. So one other thing, if you are already subscribed, click that little bell if you haven't clicked it. If you click that little bell, it really helps the channel. And of course, if you have any friends that you think would like the content, let them know. That's always a way to help the channel, introduce new people to it. The YouTube algorithm tends to privilege mainstream news over independent news, so sometimes the best way to grow independent sources is through word of mouth and networking. So if you have any friends that would like this content, let them know. Okay, guys, have a good night. I will see you with a new video sometime tomorrow, at the very least. I don't know if I'll make another one tonight. I might watch that Chris Hayes interview, but I don't know if I have it in me to make a video tonight. But I will see you guys soon. Okay, have a good one, guys. Thanks so much.